Hey.
Hey Adam, how's it going, buddy?
All right.
All right, so we got a bunch of people that can't wait to talk with you, can't wait to hear your analysis on my questionable play for sure.
Good.
Once again, they all pretty much know the what's going to be happening here. We're going to be going over the review, and then after that, we're going to be doing a Q&A with you. So that's kind of how it's going to go down. I did ask the chat to make sure that they tell us if the sound is okay. And we are on no delay, so we're absolutely live here. So guys, how does the volume sound? I know you guys can hear me, so you guys can hear Adam perfectly. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Bubba. All right, so what we're going to be doing here is I'm going to send Adam my team viewer code right here. And I'm going to assign you control because I know you're pretty much probably like me when it comes to team viewer. The control is very important when going through hand histories.
Yep.
And I mean, the one thing about, so this is going to be your call, Adam. Now, my HUD is super congested with the Spin and Go Pro HUD. So when I played earlier today, I played a lot of guys who didn't really have that many, I didn't have too many reads on these guys. So there is some merit to not necessarily using the HUD, but it's completely up to you. It's just very, very cluttered, and I want the audience to be able to see it a little bit more clearly potentially, but...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a HUD is something that is is a tool to help you. If you're not getting a lot of value out of it, there's no reason to use it. I didn't use a HUD for most of my spin and go play just because there wasn't really a good one available. I think that the 2016 spin HUD's pretty good. I'm really excited. We've got the coffee spins HUD coming out any day now. It's been coming out any day now for the last month. There's always like little last minute tweaks and stuff like that. But hopefully, within a week or two, we'll have the coffee spins HUD. And I've been really happy with that. Obviously, it's also sort of cluttered. It's big in a sense. But what I like about it is that all the stats are useful. All the stats are ones that, come up fairly commonly that converge. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, a HUD is definitely something that, is certainly secondary to proper poker strategy. I mean, a HUD's not going to make you a winning player by any means.
Exactly. I completely agree
Help
with
you
that.
get better, but, it's always one of these things I hear, a HUD gives you an unfair advantage. Well, if you take a player who's good at poker, they'll beat a player who's bad at poker no matter what. Even if the bad player uses a HUD and the good player doesn't. It just won't make that big of a difference. It's just to push out a little bit of extra edge. It's allow you to play a few more tables, spot a few more things. It's just really a way to make you better able to play the player, in a sense. Really, I mean, that's why I sort of think that a lot of the sort of anti-HUD talk is a little bit like, well, wait, do you really want everyone to play just like static strategies and not pay attention and not like adjust? A HUD is sort of a way to, make the game more human in my view because it allows you to adjust and play the player a little better with a little bit more, clear information.
I definitely agree, and we play a lot of hypers on the stream a lot, and a lot of heads up. So we always use the coffee HUD, anyways. We do coffee calcs on here all the time as well. So I mean, it's a spot where people understand that with the HUD, you still need to know a lot about poker in order to simply get better in the situations. It's not just going to turn you into Phil Ivey in a sense. You really have to have a really good understanding of the game before you can even want to look at it. I remember the first time I ever got the coffee HUD. It actually put me on a little bit of a downswing because I was so fascinated with all the stats and I was always looking to exploit, but it was a small sample size. And I think that's one of the biggest leaks when you're talking about HUDs in general is that without a big enough sample size, you almost hurt yourself by trying to exploit too soon.
Yeah, and especially without a lot of care and sort of diligence as to how you use the stats. There's a lot of stats that sort of have correlations with each other. And so in many places, you want to look at just not one stat, but a few surrounding the spot. The most common example I always give is if you're looking at either limp or min-raising range, it's really important to not just look at the frequency with which they're min-raising and limping, but also how much they fold to not-all and 3-bets and 3-bet shoves. Not only to make the decision whether to 3-bet or, or ISO or whatever, but also to get an idea of their range composition. Because if your opponent's calling a shove a lot, well, that likely means their range has a lot of hands that can call a shove, right? And so that makes their range stronger. You can even find places where people are polarized. If
Yep.
people are folding to shoves a very similar amount of the time as they fold to small, not all-in ISO erases in general, then you likely know they're polarized because they don't have that stuff in the middle that can that folds to a shove but calls a not all-in ISO or a not all-in 3-bet. And so it's using, it's that kind of advanced HUD use, I think, that really can allow you to, unlock the full potentials of using a HUD is really sort of diligent use and careful. But in the end, I mean, I've always said that, as much as you can sometimes misinterpret a HUD, it's still like generally better to have the information than not have it. I mean, in some sense,
Very true.
information is our currency in poker, and the more information you have, generally the better. Yes, you have to be careful, small sample sizes, misinterpretations, things like that. But to me, those tend to be minor issues compared to like not having a HUD at all, especially heads up and stuff like that.
And I know.
It gives good information that has clean stats, it's better to use one than not use one in most cases.
I agree, and I know one of the things a lot of people love is the effective stacks. The already, it being okay. Let me go back to that. Sorry about that. Is it too small for you there, Adam? Right there.
Because this is the window. Oh yeah.
Yeah,
No,
it's just a window. It's a little bit of a window, so the people who are watching it can see a full view of it. It's just the way the overlay is, unfortunately.
no, that's fine. Yeah, we can maybe make it slightly bigger though, right? We can do something like that.
Yeah, as long as we don't cut off the. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I see the little bar. Yeah, there we
Okay.
go. Oh, that went too far.
Perfect. I mean, even that's not that bad because you're not just cutting off the hands. It's just a little bit of the outlay, so it's fine.
Yeah.
So all right, guys. So we're gonna be going over this now. Adam has complete control, guys. So it's not even me. This is all Adam right now. He's gonna dissect my game. Hopefully, I can learn a few things. I know I will. Every time I watch even a smaller video of his, I pick up something new. So. Gonna be great. Once again, hold your questions until the end, guys. Bubba already said putting Adam online without a HUD is already good for like a lot of people because he's so good with the HUD. So just a little bit of a joke there, which is awesome. So let's get it going here, and all right. So let's see what I can do here. Go for it.
Yeah. Just before I forget, is this Twitch record this? Are we going to be able to share this?
Yes, all of my videos are automatically recorded. So as soon as this is over, everybody who wants to can go right on Twitch. And go to my most previous, I think it lasts up to 2 weeks or so. I'm sure we could extract it and maybe put it on husingo.com or something like that as well, potentially, yes.
Sounds good. All right, just wanted to double check. All right, so this is kind of a fun decision already. There's a lot of closeness in small blind versus big blind play. There's a lot of room to use different sizings, a lot of room to limp or min-raise or 3x. It's worth noting that balanced play calls for 3xing. All of the near GTO solutions do not min-raise. They pretty much only 3x.
Okay.
It's plausible they use a bigger size as well. It's something that hasn't really been researched. I have inklings that they might use another size on top of 3x, a bigger size, but it's a little bit of speculation at this point. I know for ISOing, it uses out of position, it ISOs to 3x as well as a giant size.
Now, how do you feel about like a T45 here? Because I know that a lot of players on PokerStars, obviously we're playing on WPN here. PokerStars has a lot more, a bigger player pool, a lot more recreationals. I realized that on this site, people don't really fold to a min-raise all that often, so I started using T45. What do you think about that?
It's fine. Yeah, again, I mean, GTO uses 3x, so there's a lot of room to crank up your size.
Yep.
It's absolutely fine. I mean, you want to think about, what you're doing and what range you're sort of doing it with. The bigger sizing you're using, generally the more polar your range is going to be. The junkier your bluffs, and generally the stronger your value hands.
And Adam, for the people who don't know what polar is, can you please explain that to them?
Yeah, so polarized just means that you sort of have like a separation between your bluffing range and your value range. So a merged range, I don't like that term, but the merged range is the opposite. It's when you sort of have all the different types of hands. You have very strong hands, middling hands, weak hands. A polar range generally has just weak hands and strong hands. But then you can sort of think about the degrees of polarization as to like how strong are the strong hands and how wide is that sort of value range? How strong are the weak hands and how wide is that range? Also sort of gives you information. But yeah, polarized is the concept that there's sort of a separation that's sort of created by the range. So anyways, yeah, here I think opening's fine. I think limping is also very, very good versus a wide variety of players. A lot of regulars ISO too much. like quite a lot too much, especially ISO shove too much, ISO pretty big sizes too much. And so limp shoving can also be very, very profitable here.
Okay, great. And D-Negs is a bad reg, says, what buy-in level were these games at? The $25. Yes, thank you, Backpack. Okay, sorry about that, Adam. Continue.
Yeah, you mean $30?
Oh, 20.
40?
Well, they added 25s on WPN.
Oh, I didn't notice.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's,
okay.
it's brand new. That's why I figured I'd play those today. So
Yeah.
kind of a new field.
Yeah. Why didn't they add hundreds?
I took forever to add 25s. I have no idea. I was aiming for 60s as well.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, because I guess, what did they have before? They had like from 10s all the way jump up to 40.
40, which is hard when you're talking about the variance and the amount of buy-ins you need. Exactly. It was a
it's
head
not
scratcher.
for upcoming players. It's good to have a cleaner buy-in jump so that you don't have to like grind forever at the 10s before you...
A little bit of connecting the gap a little bit.
Absolutely. No, it probably is for the best. I'm just being greedy.
I've been complaining the whole time. Don't worry about it.
So this is a spot where, I mean, I think a lot of people just sort of snap 4-bet. And when you're out of position, there is more incentive to 4-bet. But generally, I mean, flatting versus most players can be really good and preferable with a lot of these kind of middle strength hands. And so I do like flatting here, ace 10 suited. I do think it's better than shoving. The idea is simply that when you shove here, what hands are you getting called by? Like, how much are you really shoving for value? Is he really clicking it back and calling a shove with ace 7 off? You know, even king queen off.
And that was my question. I was like, what kind of range do you put, even if he's a recreational? I mean, what kind of range do you, like this minor clickback? I think everybody kind of is like, like this seems kind of strong. So by jamming here, at best, you're probably flipping, you know? So it's an interesting spot.
I think it's, you know, these min 3-bet ranges tend to be, again, very polar. They sort of tend to be polarized between their value range being really, really nutted. A lot of big pocket pairs. People love to click back their aces, kings, queens. Yep. So these ranges always have a good amount of weight on that. And then it's sort of polarized between that and a lot of random bluffs. The bluffs tend to be all over the place. They usually have a little bit of value. They're not like 7 deuce off here. But they tend to be all over the place. You know, there's some queen 7 off, 10-8 off, king deuce off. There is a little bit of weird ace-x, like ace 7 off, weird low pocket pairs occasionally. There's a lot of weird stuff otherwise. But they do have a pretty big portion of big pocket pairs. And obviously we don't get value from those. And a lot of the random junk folds to a shove.
Exactly.
So we flat. And we're fine with it. Again, especially in a, you know, if we were heads up, playing in position in the small blind post flop as opposed to here where we're going to play out of position, it would be 100% clear flat. When you're out of position, it's a lot more justifiable generally to 4-bet shove or limp shove than it is in heads up play. So here, just go ahead and flat. And this is pretty nasty. We can probably just go ahead and hero fold. His sizing's pretty big while still looking kind of creepy.
Exactly, yep.
And we don't have a backdoor flush draw. It's really, really important in these places where you want to make wider floats to look for backdoor flush draws. It's sort of, you know, it's the same concept as pre-flop. Like, suited hands are better than offsuit hands by a pretty big margin. It turns out the margin's pretty similar, actually, for backdoor flush draws versus non-backdoor flush draw hands. So this is a really great spot. If we had a backdoor flush draw, I'd be really happy to float. I noticed that 3 of our ace 10 suited have a backdoor flush draw here, and I'd be fine floating one street, especially maybe bet a little smaller. But as played, I'm happy just check folding.
Now, would you also say that when you're playing versus, let's say, a thinking player, maybe a reg, maybe even a bad reg, on a texture like that, before you even thinking about floating, would you also have to kind of utilize the fact that, well, it's a pretty dry board texture, and there's going to be a lot of really good barrel cards for this opponent to kind of, you know, hammer away on the turn and potentially make my life even more miserable?
Sure, but, I mean, we've got to, again, if we had a backdoor flush draw, that wouldn't be such a big deal.
Okay.
Because, you know, again, we've got, 10 outs to a flush draw? So immediately, you know, close to, there's less than 50 turn cards, so immediately we're hitting more than 20% of time with a flush draw. And on top of that, we hit aces and 10s, and we're pretty happy continuing with those.
Very true.
Depending on the situation, if we expect really wide barreling, we can probably float on a queen or a king sometimes too. It's not the end of the world. We'll have a gut shot with ace high. So yeah, I mean, it's not the end of the world. And notice that like the more your opponent barrels, the better implied odds you have on hitting, when you hit your pair of aces, right?
True.
Like a guy who's really aggressive who's going to try to barrel is pretty likely to want to barrel when the ace comes on the turn. And so that also improves your implied odds when you do hit an ace. So it's important not to be, think a little bit more objectively about barreling. It's not always bad. When you hit stuff, it's really good that they barrel a lot. And so the more your hand's able to hit stuff, the more you don't mind barreling. Like, again, I mean, if we hit our backdoor flush draw and he barrels rivers a lot, well, that's amazing because he's probably going to barrel when the flush gets there enough times
Very
and
interesting.
pay us off.
I really, yeah, I think that's great. I think that's great. Yeah.
It tends to be worse for hands that can't really develop into something, more, strong, like more pure bluff catchers. Again, it tends to be worse for something maybe like ace 10 with no backdoor, or weak pairs sometimes. Although even weak pairs can improve to two pair. So it's still never really the end of the world. Yeah, this is pretty standard. Again, there's always a lot of arguments, button, min raise, limp. They tend to be extremely similar in EV, so.
I know there's a lot of different strategies out there.
Yeah.
A lot of regs are going back and forth with what's better, limping or min raising, or some. I've even seen some people go with bigger sizings on the button, which I'm not a big fan of. But
Yeah.
there's just a lot of different things going on, so it's very interesting.
Yeah, so far there hasn't been any conclusive evidence as to whether one is better than the other. I mean, there's some situations where, you want to make an adjustment. It's important to sort of think, well, that sort of means that probably the EVs are pretty close in GTO play. In some sense, like the baseline EVs, you can think of it, are very similar for min raising and limping. So that also does give us a lot of control as to, when we have specific situations. We have reads on our opponents. We have, certain stack depth situations. There'll be a lot of places where you might want to limp. Common examples are if if there's a short stack player, we might prefer to limp to avoid allowing him cheap 3-bet shoves in a sense.
Yep.
Another really good one to think about is if you have a very strong player on the small blind and a weaker player in the big blind, that likely makes min raising better because you're more likely to sort of isolate the weak player. Strong small blind players tend to be pretty tight, so you min raise, they'll fold a bunch, and then the weak player on the big blind is likely to call you a good amount, and you get to play just heads up versus them.
In position.
Yeah.
Yep.
Conversely, if you've got a strong player in the big blind and a weaker player in the small blind, you may actually want to limp and force three-way play. Give yourself still a shot at playing against the weak player post in position. Rather than min raising, folding out the weak player and getting called by the strong player, you can consider limping and forcing three-way action a lot more often. But obviously, again, if you've got read stuff on ISOs a lot, you're going to want to limp more traps. If you've got read, say, 3-bet a lot, you'll want to min raise more traps. There's going to be more obvious adaptations. But those are sort of key ones to know. And so there's a lot of freedom and flexibility. Generally, like the VPIP of our range is going to be pretty similar. We're not going to really want to vary that other than with stack depth. But the decision to whether to limp or min raise different parts of our VPIP range will depend a lot on the situation. But readless, I think I generally min raise most of my range deep and limp most of my range shallow, with some limps thrown in deep and some min raises thrown in deep.
Now, what effective stacks would you say where you completely write off min raising, or there might not be a stack depth where you just completely write it off?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably around like 12 BBs, 10 BBs, we probably should be just limping and open shoving. I mean, it's stacked up to we're open shoving a lot. Open shoving sort of competes with min raising for, the best decision, more than it competes with limping, especially shallow. So, yeah, there will be, especially once you get really shallow, you'll probably want to just limp and open shove.
Sounds good.
But again, I mean, everything's read-based. Like if you have reads that, your small blind and big blind are massive nits shallow, hey, go ahead and min-raise.
Yeah, I mean, super exploitable for sure, yep.
Pretty standard. So we min-raise, we again get 3-bet by the same guy. It's a min 3-bet. At least we know not to give him quite as much credit this time.
Yeah, we're going to see a lot of this guy, too. He played all morning with me.
And we make a clear call on the flop. You shouldn't be folding pairs on the flop. We've got too much showdown value, plus, again, outs to 2-pair, which are extremely valuable. We hit 2-pair, but not the one we wanted. And... once your opponent checks here, there is actually room to go for a value bet. So many people will check here with extremely bluff catcher heavy ranges. You know, just there's just so much of a tendency amongst players to barrel with their value and also a lot of their air and draws. And so once they check, they end up really being weighted towards weaker stuff. And so there's some room here to value bet. There are ace highs in particular that will call our bet. He could have a weird pair of threes or twos that check calls the turn. On the other hand, we still have to be careful. There's still actually some pocket pairs that beat us that sort of will check call as a bluff catcher. Pocket fours through pocket sevens makes a lot of sense. Even occasionally pocket nines, tens. So we still need to be a little bit careful, but I think it's actually pretty good here to go ahead and put in a small value bet. I'd probably bet somewhere around 100.
I don't remember. I checked back. I wasn't sure what I did. I think I was a little bit worried that he min raised from the small blind, and I think that I don't know how good this guy is because I never played him before today, but I still do think that sometimes players, even with like you said, nines and tens, that like, oh, an 8 hits, he might have an 8. I'm scared now, you know, and they check back as well.
Yeah, and you just kind of want to try to, you know, compare how many hands that are better that call you versus how many hands are worse.
Yep.
It's not, I mean, on the turn, things are messy because things have equity, you know, nothing's dead, you know, hands are live, etc. But it's still a first order good rule of thumb, you know, on the river it holds perfectly is that you generally want more than 50% equity when called or, you know, value when called. You generally want to beat more hands than beat you. And yeah, you need to weigh that by how much you beat them by and how much, you know, they beat you by, etc. But yeah, here I still think that there's enough, you know, his range has enough random ace highs, king queen high, king jack high, king 10 high that check calls turn. And not that many combos of pocket pairs, especially when he min 3 bets that generally doesn't contain a lot of low pocket pairs. People tend to raise bigger because they don't know how to play them post. They get scared. So with 4s to 7s, you expect more shoving or giant 3-betting and stuff like that. So I'm pretty happy here. On top of that, you know, we do have some protection. You know, if he folds hands like queen jack, queen 10, we're folding out 2 overs, or even, 9-6, we fold out 2 overs. And as much as that shouldn't be the basis of your decision for betting, I mean, in some sense, if you're betting only for protection, you're bluffing, right? Like if you're only betting to fold out, you know, some of your opponent's value, well, that's actually literally bluffing. Protection is a way to get value, to be able to bet thinner for value. When you already have a little bit of value and it seems very thin, protection can be sort of that tiebreaker where if you have a lot of protection and you're folding out extra equity share, it's like another source of value. It makes, you know, it's like getting called by a few hands that are worse because you folded them out. And so it can be a good way to sort of get a little bit extra value. And here it does play a pretty big role too. So pretty happy with that. And then with betting here, again, probably not super big. We do want to keep his ace highs, king highs floating. Again, we shouldn't be overthinking this protection concept. We don't want him to fold with king queen. The idea is he will fold 2 overcards on the turn. And so we do benefit from folding those out. Whereas if we had like trip 8, we wouldn't. Right?
Are you going to, if you bet the turn, are you thinking about betting some rivers as well? Or is it just a blocker bet and you're just checking back almost every river?
No, I think we're probably checking back most rivers.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, arguably if an ace or a 3 come, you could think about it.
Yeah.
There's some room. Although an ace isn't really that good because we expected him to float with ace high on the turn. And exactly. And obviously our kicker won't play because we'll be 3-paired. So yeah, probably not. But I mean, if you have really good reads, you can sometimes get greedy in those places. If you know that they're really capped and, you know, have hero calling tendencies, sure. But in most cases, yeah, you gotta be really careful value betting too thin.
I hate that I didn't check there. I hate that I didn't bet that river. That's a bad not bet there, for sure.
Yeah, I think, as played, we probably do bet the river. For the same reason we bet the turn. It's not quite as good of a bet as on the turn, because, I mean, he's got more hands that beat us, but he's also more capped because he checks to us on the river. But there's no protection on the river.
Exactly.
So I think it's fine to check back the river, but yeah, you could try to get tricky here and bet like 90 to try to get him to call some random ace high. But I think the turn's really the place where he should be betting.
And unfortunately, guys, on WPN, they don't let you see mucked hands, so that's one of the downsides, unfortunately.
It's all right. We can't be as results-oriented. Yeah, this is a pretty standard flat. There's some room where like 3-bet shoving can be good versus some people. It's pretty thin though, out of the big blind because we get to play in position post. There's some room where you could 3-bet, maybe not all in for thin value. It's another one of these places where play still isn't really super well explored and examined. And so there still sort of are a lot of options. And options tend to run close. We're 24 BBs. We could take a quick look at... Oh, we can't.
Well, I'm pretty sure these guys were like statless. Like the first time I've ever played any of these guys, I don't think, for the most part.
Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah, this is one of these places where I'm sort of tempted, when I'm completely readless, at least to get a guideline. It can help to look at, GTO solutions, for example, or any other existing solutions you have.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a spot I'm just really quickly loading up simple post flop. We can go through the hand. And I'm loading up those the small blind versus big blind GTO solutions.
Mm-hmm.
They were advertised recently on HSNG.com. They're going to be turned into a video pack, so if you want to wait for the sort of explanation and more analysis of them, it's probably fine to wait getting that together. But I can tell you 23 BBs versus a min raise. This hand is indifferent between shoving and flatting. Okay, that's pretty much what I thought.
And as for those packs, I was checking that out on husingo.com actually this morning as well. So if you guys want, go to husingo.com, check it out. I would watch this first, and then afterwards go check it out. It looks very, very interesting. I can't wait for it.
Yeah,
it's gonna be
I mean,
cool.
GTO solutions are always really interesting because they give you some like fundamental information about the game itself. There's no assumptions made on how your player plays other than that they're trying to maximize their expectation.
Yep.
And so they're, as far as their use at the tables, direct use at the tables, it's pretty limited, in my opinion. We should be looking to make the most money versus our opponents, and that means adjusting. And at the same time, like, they're also very complicated ranges that have a lot of mixing that can make them very difficult to work with. But again, if you understand what's going on with the mixing, the fact that ace-8 off here, 3-bet shoves around, it looks like about 40% of the time and flat 60% of the time, that all that means is that 3-bet shoving and flatting are close. And if we have reads our opponent min raises a lot, we probably want to shove.
Yep.
And if we don't have that read, we probably want to flat. Or if we have a read they play bad post or, maybe min raise a value heavy range, we're definitely happy flatting. So that's sort of one of the nice uses of these GTO ranges. They kind of give you some baseline estimates, and then from there you can do a better job adjusting. All right, and then we have a pretty clear call. I mean, you should not at all be thinking about folding this hand. We're in position with a flush draw and ace high to boot. He barrels turn, and this is where we have to be a little bit careful. He's betting half pot, which is not generally that good for us coming from a recreational player. Recreational players, actually, well, I guess recreational players will bluff with half pot size. Regulars will sometimes almost not bluff at all with half pot sizes on the turn here. But it's worth noting that, small sizes in a place like this tends to make their range sort of more weighted towards some sort of value. It might be kind of thin, together with some traps.
Maybe a merged range as well?
Generally, not so much. Well, there's usually not a lot of bluffs, is sort of my point.
Mm-hmm.
Small sizes, a lot of people are sort of value heavy with small sizes in the sense that they just don't bluff with them because they don't think they'll get enough folds. And so we generally want to be a little bit careful in that sense that, there's not going to be a lot of room for him to pure bluff us on the river. We're obviously calling here. I mean, we have a flush. We even have a straight flush draw. Well, there's no way we're folding this half pot bet, but we want to be really careful on the river. If he suddenly jams here, I think we can make a pretty happy laydown. If he's half potting the turn or betting even a little smaller, then jams the river, there just aren't going to be really that many bluffs. Mm-hmm. And his value range for betting small is going to be sort of polar between thin stuff that probably doesn't want to shove the river and nuts, which probably does. And I think once he checks to us, we should probably go ahead and value bet. Especially with this run out, there's a lot of room where he's not going to want to fold a straight sometimes. He's got random 2-pair that he might want to call with. Our club is pretty good. We only lose to the 9 and the king and ace.
Well, the ace bets for sure. I mean, you would have to say the ace bets probably. The king, I mean, I think the king probably bets too. Versus most recreational probably bet like maybe a smaller sizing on the river as well with the king.
Yeah. So we're really looking at very few clubs that beat us, and still a lot of clubs that are worse.
Very
We do
true.
expect him to probably value bet the turn with some weak clubs and look to check call river. So I would go ahead and value bet there. Not big. He does have traps here, so we do need to be careful. We shouldn't be shoving. But, something, I don't know, anywhere between half pot and 90. I'd say the lowest I'd go here is 90.
Are you always bet folding this river?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think bet calling here. I mean, unless you have really good reads, your opponent's a crazy maniac or something. Yeah, we're bet folding. People don't check shove enough bluffs almost ever, and so yeah, your intent should be a check fold.
I wonder if he calls there. That'd been interesting to see if he would have called there.
Yeah, good chance, especially to a 90. So here we go ahead and limp. That's fine. Again, it's close to min raise, but GTO solutions do like to limp these weaker high card hands, so it's fine. He min raise, yeah, it seems to be a standard. Despite we don't really care about it too much. And this is kind of an interesting flop. Now that we know he's been sort of clicking back essentially 100% of the time now, I think, I would be pretty tempted to continue with his hand versus c-bet by check raising. Our hand has a good amount of equity still. It's not great, but we've got an overcard, so we've got like 3 outs to a king. So it's kind of like a mini crappy gut shot. Plus, we do actually have the 3 of diamonds does give us a backdoor straight draw. A 4 gives us an open-ender, an ace gives us a gut shot, and a 6 gives us a gut shot. So there are extra good turn cards for us. Again, recognizing backdoor equity is extremely important if you want to fine-tune your strategies. It's a great way to push your edge. Is by preferentially playing hands with backdoor equity over hands that don't. And so this is a cool spot. I would probably go for a check raise. This is also the kind of board where we don't really expect him to hit very much, but we do expect him to bluff a lot on this kind of texture. So, and as played, I'm fine check folding. You could try to bluff here. It's fine too. We have a little bit of equity. But we just have so many better bluffing hands at this point because we have flush draws, straight draws, so many different straight draws, so many different flush draws that, yeah, I think this hand just is too weak to want to bluff with.
Now, would you consider that turn, let's say we did check raise to flop, would you consider that turn a good place to raise because he would probably be continuing with all of his flush draws, etc., or is that a kind of spot where you just kind of give up because now it's getting a little bit too messy?
Yeah, I would probably just give up. Generally, out of position, it's a good rule of thumb that you should be always looking to check fold the bottom of your range. Now, there are exceptions to this. If you have reads, especially on the flop, there'll be places where people just overfold by so much that you want to sort of bet everything. Every last piece of air wants to bluff. But if you're not sure your opponent's going to overfold, you're not 100% sure quite how much your opponent's going to fold, but you still want to bluff, when you're out of position, it's always better to bluff with some equity than none. Now, that's something I hear a lot from players like, oh yeah, I always make sure to only bluff with equity. Well, there's tons of places where that's not true. In position for barreling, it's actually completely not true. There's tons of places where GTO strategies bet the bottom of their range, complete airballs, and we want to exploit people by betting airballs. And it can be very, very important part of our in-position strategy to c-bet and barrel with airballs. But out of position, because we have this option to check fold, generally we want to take the worst hands and check fold them. If you think about just like range construction or just, how much money you put in the pot, it makes sense that on average, you want to try to put less money in with junk than with strong hands, right? And so out of position, a good rule of thumb is that you don't want to bluff airballs. You don't want to bluff the bottom of your range. And so once that turn card comes, I'm thinking, okay, well, this is pretty clearly the bottom of my range because I've got so many hands that had a club, right? Because I probably want to have lots of 3 of clubs hands that check raise. I want to have lots of backdoor flush draws that check raise that just got there.
Yep.
And they can barrel because they've got a flush draw. I also improved to some random, straight draws. I can barrel those. And so we would probably need to be pretty greedy to want to bluff with just king high. King high is better than nothing. If we had check raised the flop with, let's say, I don't know, Jack 3 of diamonds, obviously we would, prefer to check fold that over our king 3 here. It's weaker. And so sometimes you can get away with turning king highs into a bluff on the turn. If you have places where you expect your opponent to fold a little extra, you can kind of widen your bluffing range by starting to include some more hands that have a little bit of equity and a little bit of outs. And, having 3 outs to your king isn't bad. But on this board in particular, our outs to a king aren't particularly useful because of the flush possibilities. So, and we on top of that do have a little showdown. We can check fold down and hope we beat random, 8-6.
I think I win this hand, actually, if I recall correctly.
6-4.
No, not this one.
There are random hands that we can still beat. Interesting note, he checked down with ace-8 here, ace-high, and he even had a flush draw on the turn. So we can kind of click through quickly and see if there's any reads. Nothing in particular. So this is fine. Flatting's also still probably okay versus a lot of players. You sometimes want to be pretty suspicious here. He's been raising extremely shallow. Some people only min raise the nuts this shallow. It's 100% pocket pairs and big ace X. So be a little bit, aware of your opponent's tendencies here as to, how much do you think he's capable of min raising bluffs, or min raising thin hands like king queen or queen jack intending a call shove. But as standard, it's fine to shove. I mean, we're not going to go very wrong just because we have such a strong hand. And so we're always going to have pretty good equity uncalled. Even versus a pocket pair, we've got an out and suitedness and stuff.
Very true.
Super standard limp folds. Although we're actually kind of deep. You could still min raise here too. I thought we were a little shallower. What are we? We're like 18. You could still min raise here. Versus a lot of players, unless you have reads that they 3-bet a lot. But I guess we have a read that he 3-bets a lot.
He was kind of just spewy a little bit for sure.
Yeah, he's been clicking back all the time, so pretty clear limp given the reads. Super clear flat. Again, on the flop, there's a lot of closeness. There's a lot of room where we probably want to strongly consider VPI playing this hand versus a C-bet, a small C-bet. In particular, he could float here. We'd prefer to have more playability with floating, again, a backdoor flush draw with our king high, so we can hit more turns. But floating here is okay, and check raising is also okay. Again, it's fine to turn this into a bluff and use it for its, king high outs, because it's not super often we're going to be able to check it down and win with king high.
Very true. Are you finding that more regs are checking back these type of paired boards on flops these days, or?
I don't know. They go through phases. They go through phases where, regs will c-bet 100% on these boards, absolutely everything, and then, they'll be, they'll go through little trends of where they want to be balanced on this board and check back ace high, king high, and some pocket pairs and threes. In reality, it probably is a spot where he should be c-betting 100% of his range, especially in a limp pot, especially. But even in a min-raised pot, it's probably really good to c-bet 100%. And most likely is GTO actually to c-bet 100%. I say most likely because it depends very strongly on starting ranges. It depends just how strong his min-raising range here is, and how strong our flatting range is. But there's lots of places with these super dry boards that the in-position player in GTO play just c-bets all of their range. It's not unbalanced. There's plenty of places where in-position is supposed to c-bet everything and out-of-position is supposed to check fold a lot at the same time. And so, but I think, for the most part, once he checks back, we can be pretty squarely putting him on ace high, king high. Almost always, just because we've seen that tendency already from him. He checked back ace high. It's one of these boards where bluffing is just so good. We expect people to bluff the flop, almost always. You want to be sometimes careful. A strong strategy can also involve checking back eights here to trap. Yeah. If your opponent's overfolding massively but won't...
maybe probing a little bit too much.
Yeah, and won't exploit you checking back only eights. Then a really good exploitive strategy would be to c-bet everything except for your trip eights. Pairs of threes benefit from protection, so you don't mind them overfolding, and you still get value from king high, ace high floats. Ace high folds out, again, lots of equity share and gets called by king high. King high is just an amazing, essentially is a bluff and it's with equity. So there's a lot of room where you bet, very close to your whole range, but maybe slow play a little. Especially in limp pots, it's generally best to check back trips because people overfold by so much. In particular, it's the fact that people just don't play enough backdoor flush draws, backdoor straight draws, that make these flops not quite as difficult to continue on. If you recognize that you should be playing most of your 2-heart hands on 3-3, 8-8 with 1 heart, you'll be defending a lot wider to c-bets, and then there's more value for your opponent to c-bet their trips.
That's very interesting that you say that, because I think a lot of people, once they start getting to a certain level of poker, when they start learning, they kind of learn things and they forget how recreationals think. So what you said with the backdoor heart draw, we see a backdoor heart draw. Recreationals might see absolute air, so we always have to take that in consideration as well.
I wouldn't even say recreationals. Most regs see absolute air too.
Oh, really? Okay, wow.
Oh, yeah, I think it's still one of the things that regs leak hardest at is recognizing and using backdoor flush draws properly, even at the very high stakes. I coach guys at 500s playing against the 1K division, and I see it on both ends of the table still.
Wow. See that, guys? There's still room for the climb. See, there's still plenty of room to win in poker, guys. See that?
Yeah. Well, you can think back, even regs used to criticize weak players for, oh, yeah, you played 7 deuce because it's suited, lol. And it's like, well, actually, that is...
like now, it's like, look at me now, right? Yeah, for sure, man.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's one of those things that's still kind of entering the paradigm of high-stakes play. Because it wasn't something people really thought of and didn't really put a lot of deep thought into and didn't realize. there wasn't enough math and enough simulations and stuff to really show how much better backdoor flush draws are. They're often better by 10, 20 blinds by a factor of 5 chips. It's not like they're quite a bit stronger. Just like pre-flop, they're about the same amount stronger. And so it really, really is worth noticing those backdoor equity hands. As played, we just check down and, we hope for the best. Maybe he's got queen high this time.
I think this is the one that I took down.
And maybe we could bluff the turn, but we're fine with this. And, interesting.
There we go.
So he might be checking back air. It kind of sucks we don't get those showdowns.
Yeah, there's so much information to be had for sure. Definitely versus the bad kind of reg, whereas they do some things well, but other things really bad. Those are really important reads there.
Yeah, but that's okay. It's obviously it's symmetric. He doesn't get the reads on us either, so it's not something to be too upset about. I don't think it's that big a deal. And I guess it captures the spirit of live play more. If you're using this, if you're supplementing some live experience with heads up online, maybe it is for the best that you don't get to see those showdowns and get sort of reliant on them, because in live play you often can't see Mux cards.
That's interesting too, because I think there are people, including myself, who, when I first started playing years and years ago, I never used a HUD, and I think that I think maybe it was Coleman or somebody who said that they never really used a HUD, and they become really good at just hand reading and stuff like that as well.
I think Liv B is the most famous.
There you go. Yep, that's who it was.
Yeah. I spoke to him this summer, or last summer, I guess now, World Series, and he said he just got a HUD mine. And so he had just started using his HUD in October of this year or something.
That's good. Watch out now, right? That guy's.
Although he did admit that he was kind of stupid to not. At some point, we want to be very careful that ego and arrogance can sometimes trump good decision making, right? We don't want to make decisions based on our own feelings sometimes, when those feelings aren't necessarily corroborated by evidence. Again, more information's better. So especially if you're at the level of Liv B, of course you're going to get some edge from using a HUD, especially if you take a little bit of time to study it, which you're clearly capable of doing because you're such a high-level player. So
exactly,
there's really no reason long-term to not use a HUD. Again, it's not the end all be all. It's fine. It doesn't make that big a difference, but still.
Well, like I tell most of my students, there's no room for ego in poker. I mean, there's a confidence that you can have,
Yes.
but when your ego gets in the way, like it did in that circumstance,
Yeah.
it can hinder you more than anything
Yeah.
else.
Well, I think of it like one of the common ways that people sometimes make decisions. I think of it as like emotional-based decisions. And that's not to say we should be unemotional robots, but the idea is that emotional-based decisions are generally not max EV because they're based on external factors, generally based on the past. The emotions that were created from previous hands, tilt, fear, desired for revenge, things like that can, have previous hands influence our current decision making in, non-productive ways. And then furthermore, sometimes it's the future that can cause us fear because, we fear getting sucked out on again. And that affects our decision making. We fear the next street. We don't know how to play the next street. Stuff like that can affect our decision making. And those kind of emotional decisions just aren't going to be max EV a lot of the time. Another really common case is value betting on the river with the nuts. The idea is if you bet really small, you're going to get called very often, and you'll get that dopamine release, and you'll be like, yes, I got called by my nutted hand. When you bet really big, you might get called a lot less often, but still make more money because the times you get called, you made a ton more money. But because you're getting folds more, it doesn't feel as good to us. It doesn't, get us much pleasure for us. And so it can be very tempting sometimes to indulge those, those emotions, those pleasure sensors, and make plays that aren't max EV, just because they'll feel better than the play that is max EV. And so it is really, really important to try to be, make rational decisions at the table. Our goal should be to maximize our EV, not to make ourselves happy. Depending on, what our goal is. I mean, obviously if we're playing for fun in a home game, yeah, then it's more fun to make lighter calls and stuff like that. And we should be sort of trying to maximize in some way our fun EV. But if you're playing, trying to be a serious player, trying to get seriously better at the game, then you need to be very serious about your decision making and realize that, your goal should be to make the most money or to make the most EV. And therefore you shouldn't be acting based so much on your feelings and your emotions. That's not to say we shouldn't act based on our gut. That's not what I'm saying, but acting based on, things that make us feel more happy, or, what we sort of want to do versus what we know we need to do to make the most money.
I find it very interesting with the whole with the dopamine and all that stuff because it is a spot where unfortunately gambling can be something that affects people in a very, very negative way, but there is that release of chemicals within the brain which we can't necessarily see, and not a lot of people know a lot about it. It's so intriguing. It really is, and I think that that type of research might be kind of the next big thing with poker as well, coming up in the next few years.
Yeah. It's definitely a real thing. I used to, when I was grinding full time back in the day, I used to have serious issues with sort of stomach cramping. And I didn't know what it was. It took me a long time to figure out that it was adrenaline. That it was, when I was moving up in stakes and, it was causing that adrenaline boost when I was playing more regs, when I was just a little more stressed due to downswings or whatever. Suddenly grinding created, all this kind of chemicals in my stomach, and I ended up having really serious stomach aches. I couldn't figure out what the fuck it was for a while.
That's crazy.
It's one of those things where it's like, why am I otherwise perfectly healthy and I'm getting these stomach aches? And it took me a long time to figure it out. And even nowadays, I still get it sometimes when in particularly intense situations, playing heads up, high stakes against very, very good players. I still get that, obvious release of chemicals.
That heart beating a little bit faster, then adrenaline rush a little bit.
2 hours, an hour after my session, I'll have a stomach cramp. I'm like, at least I know what that's caused by now.
I think it's going to be so. I think probably a lot of people who play poker have that same thing, and you know what I mean. It's something that people don't like to talk about, but it's probably something that's really common.
Yeah, and it's. There's ways to deal with it. Again, there's ways to condition our bodies and, get ourselves used to that kind of stuff. But, at some point, we also have to admit that we're all human. And some of this stuff is part of being human. I strongly believe that humans aren't really, evolutionarily created to be good at dealing with very large amounts of random numbers thrown at us that affect our lives. Like this amount of variance on such short term scales is just not something that our human minds are, created to deal with. And so it can be very, very difficult. I mean, it's one of the harder elements of being a poker player.
Now, I think some questions you might hear after the session might revolve around, like, what do you do outside of poker? As for, like, you hear a lot of meditation, you hear a lot about working out and being healthy and eating healthy. Definitely have people who sit at, like, live games in 10 hours for 6 days straight. Do you feel that's a very important aspect of poker as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's an important aspect of life. Right?
Very true. Very
it's
true.
important to any sort of performance. Obviously, with poker, we're not running around, so it's not quite as necessary as in like tennis or something like that. But it's still, extremely necessary, and it's, there is a huge correlation. I mean, almost all of the high stakes guys meditate. There's got to be something behind it. A lot of, almost all of them, have some sort of gym routine if you read about any of the interviews. And almost all of them, at least in some ways, try to eat healthy. Now, that's not to say everyone does, and that's not to say that there aren't players who have great success without caring about any of that stuff and are fat slobs and just grind all the time. I'm sure. But we think, well, how much better would those guys be at grinding if they weren't?
Exactly.
Right? Like, how much better would they be, and how much more mentally focused would they be able to be if their, body was functioning at maximum capacity? So, yeah, I'm a big believer in healthy diets, exercise, and meditation can all be really, really important things.
I think a good analogy, because we do that a lot on stream today, I love to do it, is like, for example, an athlete who's coming out of college going to NFL or in any sport who is just blessed with unbelievable talent, but he doesn't put work in the weight room. He doesn't study film, but he's already really good. Imagine how good he would be if he was somebody like Peyton Manning, who won the Super Bowl last night, who studies a lot, who does everything right. Like, he would be so much better. Those things become really important in the long run.
And the truth is that, that kind of natural talent will only get you so far.
Exactly.
There's one thing I've learned. It's natural talent only gets you so far, especially in poker. I think even more than in many professional sports, natural talent really can only get you so far, especially in the games today.
I agree.
That same guy is just not going to be success in the NFL. The NFL is just so much stronger than college. And that player will just not be able to succeed. They'll start out with maybe, pretty mediocre numbers and probably never really get better unless they put in that extra work. So, yeah, it's definitely really, really important. So getting back to the hand, so we make a pretty clear limp flat, and we bet when check two, which I think is fine now given the reads. He clearly tends to be checking some sort of, weaker.
Do you like checking back here at all, or you think it's a little bit too strong of a kicker?
I think it's not really our kicker. I think it's just a place where we assume he's capped enough. Like, he's just on this kind of texture, especially, like, chances of him slow playing or like check calling king X or check raising it or check raising with aces or something are just so slim. It's a wet board. People get scared. And so just a spot where we just know he's going to be weighted towards weaker hands. All that being said, I don't really like your sizing. While we think mostly he's going to be weighted towards weaker hands, we should still give a little bit of credit where we don't really know, and he might be check raising. He does have sets here, like set of kings, queens, nines, that can potentially check raise us. And that makes life a little bad for betting big. And it's also a spot where if we bet big, we're also folding out a lot of his showdown value. Like ace high can probably fold to this sizing. Whereas if we bet smaller, it probably flips.
Do you think a lot of hands of potentially like ace high, maybe pair not? Like, do you think some of those hands do ISO pre-flop though as well?
Some of them. I mean, it's really hard to say. He's been ISO, like, it's really hard to put any range on his ISOing. He's been ISOing so much with random, with this random small size that we just have to put him on a pretty wide range here. And we have to expect him to check some of it, to bet most of his value, but he'll check some. We expect him to maybe not bluff all that much on this texture, but probably bluff some. And so it's still sort of a place where we expect him to be weighted towards, queens and nines and ace high and some maybe other random showdown. But we sort of should give him the benefit of the doubt and still take into account that he has some traps that can check raise us. And also give him the benefit of the doubt where he might be check folding ace high to a bigger size. So
that's true.
Basically, it's just a spot where we're value betting thin in some way or another. Like, we're looking for somewhat thin value here. He did raise, his range is still pretty strong. And generally, when you're looking to thin value bet, you should be using smaller sizes. just because you get called more, right? As I said, when you're value betting, you want to get called by more hands that beat you than called by more hands that you beat than that beat you. And so by using a smaller sizing, we get our opponent to call more hands, which generally means more hands that we beat when we're betting thin value. And so, that's sort of the general concept behind why we'd want to use a smaller sizing with thinner value. And, obviously this can be exploitable if you only do it. But, once you start worrying about exploitable, you can always balance your range. And it turns out that GTO, when it uses multiple sizes, does construct its ranges in precisely this way. It doesn't, it makes more stronger ranges that are balanced themselves, but it'll have a smaller sizing that's more weighted towards thin value than its bigger sizing, which is more weighted towards stronger value, and in a sense is more polar. So this is a great spot to kind of, realize that we're betting pretty thin there, and so we certainly shouldn't be betting any more than half pot. I mean, in general on the flop, you should be almost never betting more than half pot. It's extremely rare that it's correct. The only cases are when you have pretty solid reads, your opponent's really loose passive. They're not going to raise almost at all, and they're going to call a lot regardless of your size. Then betting big is good with big hands, and with value in general. But in a lot of these cases, this guy's been a little all over the place. We have no idea how capable he is of check raising, given that he is capable of min 3 betting in a small blind. So we should give him a little bit of the doubt, and I think that it's better here to bet smaller, get a little bit of thinner value, and I would bet probably half pot or maybe just 40. I think 40 is good there too. 40 or half pot. We fold super standard, we limp super standard, and yeah, we're flatting versus him.
He's doing so much. Yeah.
You can hero fold readless, but at this point, obviously, we're not folding to him to a min raise. He min bets the flop, which again should raise some warning signs. This is likely not going to be a whole lot of bluffs, although we're not sure. He does this weird min betting stuff all the time. And it's also probably not a whole lot of super, I wouldn't say thin value, but protecting value. It's pretty unlikely for him to do this with a jack. Or even 2-pair, just because this board's crazy wet.
Yep.
So his range here is sort of weighted towards some really, really thin value, maybe some random draws, pairs of 9s, 10s, and nuts. And with him, maybe some air as well. With some players, you can narrow down their range and actually remove air entirely. Especially regulars, if they min bet like this, they probably have 0 air. Almost ever. Especially if they underbet turns and stuff, they probably don't bluff that size ever. Because they just don't expect you to fold. So it's worth trying to get those kind of sizing tells on people. Even very strong regulars give off sizing tells. So if you can, really get your focus in and try to figure out, what is your opponent trying to do with their size, it can oftentimes give us a lot of info. And it turns out there's also population sizing tells, like randoms tend to use certain sizes with certain ranges. Pot size bets tend to be very strong. Half pot bets on the river tend to have the most bluffs of any sizing. Mm-hmm. There's all sorts of sizing tell stuff you can study, and it's something you can even just go in your database. If you're diligent with your review, you can filter for situations where you faced a bet on the river and saw showdown, and just manually go through it, and even have a little notebook next to you where you tally down all the different sizes you saw and what kind of hands they correlated with, and get some idea of what kind of sizing tells is your population giving off. Because I will almost guarantee you will find some pretty clear ones. There's some really, really big ones, and they tend to be different between recreationals and regulars, so be on the lookout for that. Regulars will be using different sizing tells, in a sense, will give off different types of sizing tells for even the same sizings as recreationals, but that's something that can kind of grow with time. And here I think this is 100% call. I don't think this is super,
I knew this was close there. I mean, I was thinking about his range here because he kept doing this and checking back. So when he bet, like we said, I figured he was a bit stronger here. And he did bet half pot. I mean, it's super really 25% equity here. I mean, I just figured his range is so weighted towards value here that it made an exploitable fold.
Yeah, it's one of these places where, we're in position, so there's a lot of room to extract value as well as even set up bluffing spots. So when you're calling in position, you generally don't need as strong of a hand to call the same sizing as when you're calling out of position. So if we were check calling this out of position, it would be close. Here, I don't think it's that close. But really the way we want to kind of analyze these spots is in terms of something called capture factor. It's a term that's defined originally in Will Tipton's Expert No Limit Hold'em Volume 2, which is an excellent textbook on poker. It's probably the best way to call it is a textbook, Volume 1 and 2. They're essentially textbooks. They're not particularly fun reads or easy reads, but they're the kind of books that really give some of the true fundamentals of solid play. So I highly recommend them. They're probably some of the best value you can get if you're willing to put in the time to study them, because they are textbooks. You have to sort of teach yourself. You have to sort of go through a class almost. It's like taking a college course or something. You have to put in the time to go through some of his examples, to go through the questions he asks, to really deep read and stuff like that. But in any case, the idea of capture factor is really simple. It's that, you say we need 25% equity to call. Well, that's not true, because equity doesn't really have, what does equity have to do with? Equity matters when you're all in, and it matters on the river, because it's just a simple measure of how many hands you beat versus hands that beat you. But when you're playing early streets on pre-flop, flop, and turn, equity just isn't a very good measure. It's an estimate. It helps you estimate how much of the pot you'll win, but it's not perfect. And so instead, we use the idea of capture factor, which is a more direct idea of what percent of the pot I will win on average, averaged over all the next streets. And so the idea is that here, we don't need 25% equity to call. We need 25% capture factor. We need to win on average over all rivers 25% of the pot. And when you start thinking about it that way, you can actually start computing some things here. So in particular, we know we have... actually, why don't you just load your calculator? I can just do it
sure, no problem.
Your end so that everyone can see the math I'm doing, because it's really simple. It's not terribly complicated, especially on the turn. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to just look at how many outs I have to my straight. That's sort of the first place where I get a lot of capture factor. So I've got 6 outs out of a deck of 46 cards left by the river. You can confirm that it's 52 minus the 4 cards on the board minus the 2 cards in our hand. On the flop, it would be 47 because there's fewer cards on the board. And so we've got about 13% chance of hitting our straight on the river. And so from there, we want to think how much, on average, how much money can we make? In this case, we'll still have, the pot will be 360 and he'll have 300 behind. So the very most we could make is about a pot size bet off of him. So let's be, but it is a 4-card straight. Let's be a little bit more pessimistic. Let's say we win about 1.5 times the pot. So that's sort of saying that we win the whole pot plus on average about a half pot bet from our opponent. So that'll count sometimes where they bet big and we call and we win a big pot. Sometimes where he bets small and we can raise and he folds, or sometimes where he checks to us, we bet half pot even and he calls. So I think 1.5 times the pot's a pretty reasonable estimate. And already we're getting, kind of close to our capture factor. We're about 20% now. And this is already, a measure of our capture factor. We're winning that percent of the pot, 1.5 times the pot. That, certain percent of the time is 13% of the time. And this contributes to our capture factor. Now, on top of this, we'll also get some capture factor off our queens and sixes occasionally. If he check folds, we can win with a pair. That doesn't mean we have to call with them. We still get some capture factor. I mean, even if it's like 10%, that's still, 10% a ton. It adds into that number quite a bit. And on top of that, we might be able to sometimes take the pot away with air.
Wait, 1 second. Aaron just said we have 8 outs, not 6.
Oh, we have 8 outs.
Open-ended.
Right.
Yep.
I'm tired. Yeah, absolutely. So actually, we're doing much better. I thought though we were a little bit low. Yeah, it's actually we hit 17% of the time. So yeah, we've got.
There we go.
I was gonna say that's already really close. I was like, why is it only 20? Yeah. So even just with our outs, we've got 8 outs out of a deck of 46 cards. I think I might have been counting 6 because we only have like 6 clean outs. I might have just instinctively.
I thought there was 3 hearts on the table because it was blocked, and you took some of the because it would be a flush instead. I think that's what happened.
But when the when the king of hearts or the 8 of hearts comes, certainly we don't have quite as good implied odds.
Yeah.
regardless, right?
True. True.
We'll have some reverse implied odds. It'll also be harder to get value because, well, our opponent probably isn't going to want to play super light when the Eight of Hearts comes. So we can maybe still think of it as like, somewhere in between these two measures.
It
We
cuts it
probably won't
different to
get
call it
any-
7.
but that's sort of the thing. Like all these little elements add up. We've got almost enough just from our draw, and then we throw in a little bit of capture factor from our queen. I mean, think about it. How much capture factor can we get off our queen? Well, let's assume our opponent checks to us on the river 20% of the time. So he barrels 80%. Huge barreling frequency. Probably more than any player we'd really expect. He checks to us 20% of the time. And, half the time we think we're good. That's already 10% capture factor. And so if we sort of just naively take our pairs, we got 4 outs to our pairs. 4? No, more. 6 outs on our pairs.
Before we do that, let's make sure the guys can see that as well.
Yeah, I always forget where it's supposed to go.
We might be able to minimize it. You know what might help here? We could do a side view as well where they can just see the calculator so you can have... Actually, no, that's not going to work either.
No,
that's going to be fine, yeah.
It's not a big deal. Just move it right here. So we've got 6 outs, 2 pairs actually. We've got 3 queens and 3 sixes. Again, they're not all equal, but if we just kind of approximate it, got about 13%. If we win about 10% the pot of those, that's another like 1.3% capture factor. It's not a ton, but it adds up. Especially the queen maybe is worth a little bit more than 10% of the pot. We start gathering a little bit of extra capture factor here and there through stuff like that and through stuff like bluffing. Generally, bluffs tend to be pretty close to 0 EV, but they can get up to 0 capture factor, but they can sometimes get up to 5%, 10% capture factor too. So it's another spot where, 10% of the time our opponent checks and we're able to take it down about half the time or something, or more than half the time. Again, we can maybe also gather some capture factor just even from times we miss, especially when we're in position. So this is how you can try to analyze some of these close decisions on the turn. Think about what's going to happen on the river. How do you plan on playing it? How much of the pot do you think you'll win on the river? How often does that happen? And sum it all up. And obviously it's not, easy. You can't really do it very easily in game. But once you get practice with it, it's not so bad. And it's not so complicated because you're breaking it up into small parts and then summing it all together. And generally those small parts aren't so hard to think about anymore. When we start thinking about, well, how much do I win off a straight? You can even go in and say, well, 80% of the time he bets and we've got this amount of equity versus his betting range. And even do a direct calculation of how much capture factor you get. On top of that, you can use GTO solutions to get some of these capture factors for in-game situations. So you can have a general idea of, well, on the flop, gut shots figure to capture around 30% in the pot versus a half pot c-bet for the most part. And so they're always calls.
So I have a question for you. For the people who are watching this right now and scratching their head and saying, what did he just do with that calculator? What do you think besides the Will Tipton books is the best approach for, let's say, a person who is a good poker player, but now he wants to take it to the next level? He wants to be like Adam. He wants to be like Cofeeyay. Where do you think the best spot for him to start with? Maybe, maybe free videos, maybe husingo.com has something. What would be your first solution for those players?
It's a good question. There's not a ton of publicly available information on these kind of topics, unfortunately. They're rather new, so there's sort of a combination of a lot of people don't really understand them well enough to explain them. I think that's probably a majority of players. Even if they kind of understand the concepts and are able to use them in game, they don't understand them to that level. There's also an element of, with new information, people want to try to keep it secret in some sense as long as possible. So there's not a lot of regs who are willing to, give away some of this stuff. There's not a ton. My math pack talks a lot about some of these concepts, but not capture factor. It was before capture factor was defined by Will Tipton. But a lot of the math in that pack you can go back and use capture factor for. Again, Will Tipton's book is probably the other authority. And I think right now that's about it. I'm working on a heads up guide to try to correct this problem, and it will have the sort of first part, the volume 1, will sort of use capture factor as just a way to get answers, and it'll mostly focus on giving good solutions and getting people to a really good starting spot in their game. And then volume 2 plans to go into more detail of calculating this stuff, how we can use it to make, fine-tuning adjustments and fine-tune our range building and stuff like that. So hopefully at some point there will be a more publicly available solution. I think right now, I think I'm probably one of the only, if not only coach that really uses some of these advanced math tools, especially capture factor, in their coaching. There's more guys who are now doing more GTO stuff, but it's still pretty rare. So it's still sort of cutting edge stuff. So it's hard to get a ton of public information about it. But and there's a ton of misinformation. There's another video pack. I think it's Big Hustlers that talks a ton about equity realization. And it's sort of pseudo capture factor. He talks about how, well, I've got so much equity, so that'll imply I win so much of the pot. And the problem is that the math's not so simple. He uses a very simple approximation where he's like, okay, I'll win 70% of my equity. And it turns out not all equity is created equal. Equity from drawing hands you almost always do better than your equity with drawing hands. It's a really good rule of thumb. Drawing hands almost always do better than their equity. A really good approximation is drawing hands do about their equity, at least the equity from drawing, times the value of the nuts on the river in terms of capture factor. So here we could even just use more simplistic analysis and say, well, we've got we have 20% equity, right? A little less. 8 out of 46. Yeah, sorry, I moved the calculator. I used the wrong calculator. We've got 8 out of 46 outs to our draw. That's 17% equity, and we sort of approximate our capture factor on the river was about 1.5. And so that's immediately a really good approximation. It actually works on the flop and even pre-flop. It even ends up that flushes tend to win about twice the pot on the river. You get about 3% equity from flushes. It turns out you do get about a 6% capture factor boost from being suited versus being offsuit. Again, the flush draws on the flop. You've got 9 outs, but each out's worth about 4%. So you end up with somewhere close to 35% equity.
Yep, 35-36%. Yep.
Yeah, and again, the nuts on the river are worth about 2. So it turns out the capture factor of flush draws on the flop is 70%. And that does, map to empirical results. It maps to GTO results really well too. So there are tricks to making this stuff easier, but again, they're not really publicly available right now, other than I guess in this session now.
Yeah, like I said, I was telling everybody all week long, the value of just, tuning into a free stream and hearing some of the things that you're saying, you literally can't even put a number on it. It's amazing stuff, for sure.
Yeah, so unfortunately, otherwise, I think, I'm trying to remember how much I talk about in my beating spins video pack. I think I sort of, again...
I'm sorry, it looks like the stream just took a shot real fast.
Oops.
Hold on one second. I'm seeing if... I don't know why it shut down real fast. Interesting. All right, give me 1 second.
Well, I think we'll try to wrap up this game and then do questions.
Yeah, that's what was my thought process too. All right, let me undo the
No,
Twitch is always having. Oh, it's good now. Hold on. All right, we're good now, guys. Everybody good?
Everyone good?
Okay, looks like we're good now. Okay, great. Very sorry about that. Okay, we're good to go. Sorry about that, Adam.
So that's how you can try to approach these kind of spots. So I think this is a pretty clear call. It's still very close in EV, right? We still saw, we maybe have 27.5%, 28% capture factor. It's obviously not a big mistake to fold here. And again, it probably would be a fold out of position, especially given the fact that we think our opponent's pretty strong here.
Mm-hmm.
But here, I think it is going to be a call. And it is worth noting the 6 of hearts actually helps you here. It's tempting to think, oh, you block some of his draws. Well, no, that's actually not that important on flops and turns. It's important on rivers, but on the flop and turn, you're more my out to my 6 is cleaner, slightly. Doesn't make that big a difference, but it's cleaner. There's also fewer heart. You can also think of it like his draws have fewer outs versus you, right? So,
Very true.
So it is important to notice, especially if we had the queen of hearts here, it would benefit us. It would give us one more clean out and one more cleaner out, and a little bit fewer bad situations in the river. All right. 9-3 suited, there's room to ISO this, but this shallow, you generally don't want to ISO suited hands. The idea being actually comes back to that concept of capture factor. When you have SPRs that have when you don't have much money behind post flop, you can't expect to have as high a capture factor of the nuts on the river because there's not as much money left on average rivers. And so hands that sort of rely on implied odds start having issues deeper stacked with building the pot. And so generally we want to try to avoid ISOing, especially non-all-in with suited hands shallow, because we're sort of cutting some of our implied odds.
How do you feel about sorry to cut you off. Oh, there you go. Sorry to cut you off, Adam. My apologies. But what's your status on playing versus maybe a bad reg or a recreational player, not necessarily ISOing them early in the match until you have reads that maybe they're a little bit more passive in those spots?
It's fine. Yeah. I think in the small blind versus big blind cases, we probably should be ISOing a lot. There's tons of evidence that show that the population just overfolds massively. And there's not a lot of downside when you're going to be in position post to building the pot. So there's a lot of evidence that in small blind versus big blind spots when the button folds, we probably should be ISOing bluffs. But in heads up, I've found that generally ISOing bluffs is very similar to checking them back versus recreational players.
Okay.
And one thing I will say versus recreational players, you should basically never bluff shove. Never ISO bluff shove, never 3-bet bluff shove. It's almost always worse than your other options because recreationals tend to call shoves pretty wide and they play bad posts. So shoving gets worse as a bluff because they call wide, and checking back or flatting gets better because they play bad posts. So generally, shoving as a bluff is something you should almost always avoid. But ISOing non-all-in still lets you use some of your post-flop skills. It's generally lower risk, sort of lower risk-reward ratio, so it can generally be a little bit better. So there's room to ISO here. There's room to ISO as a bluff versus recreationals. It's very close. It's not going to be a make or break your EV, but shoving can. Shoving bluffs can make or break your EV. If you're having issues with having lower EV/ROI than you'd like, and you bluff shove versus recreationals, easy spot. Just remove that part. You'll probably see your EV/ROI pop up by probably like 1% or 2%, depending on how much you bluff shove.
Not bad at all. Sounds good to me.
So yeah, but yeah, it's worth noting here that there's room to think about ISOing. You should always think, what am I ISOing here? What's my ISO range? What kind of range do I think my opponent's limping? But generally we want to avoid doing it with suited hands shallow. And here I would actually, in a limp pot, I would be intending to check raise versus most players.
That's what I was thinking too. Backdoor straight draw, backdoor.
Yep, backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. And people tend to see that really weak ranges. They tend to limp pretty weak ranges, and so when they stab the flop, they tend to have a lot of air, especially since most people overfold massively to limp c-bets and don't check raise. So it's one of these places where, like, they're correct to be c-betting a ton of bluffs if they think that you play like everyone else.
Yep.
And at that point, check raising and floating even becomes really good. I mean, there's a good chance that floating here is also better. Because you can float and stab and bluff the river when he checks back turn. It's also a very profitable line. And so this is one thing I work on with a lot of my students is constantly just, adapting to limped pots and, having good defending strategies versus limp c-bets, because more and more regs are limping and more players are limping a lot of weak hands and getting away with stabbing them post really, really profitably. It's a really good strategy. But we can make it much less of a good strategy by playing properly post-flop. And so, yeah, as played, we don't bluff the turn because we have 0 equity. It's complete airball. We don't want to bluff airballs on the turn unless we have incredibly good reads. On the river, you could bluff here, but villains check back 2 streets on this kind of board texture. Chances are he has some showdown, and we don't have a very high opinion of our opponent, so we probably assume he's more of a calling station.
Like with the queen, like some players just call with queen high here, even sometimes in the jack high.
Calls, pair of twos just snaps any size, stuff like that. I guess more and more though, we're now getting a read that he's just pretty passive actually.
Very face up, bets when he has it, checks back when he doesn't.
Yeah, which is really interesting because he's been so much more aggro pre, and he's kind of passive post. So here we should probably be limping. It's Pretty close though.
I
Again,
think I min raised here because he kept on clicking back with my limps. I figured it was a spot where it's kind of close. I mean, I usually always limp here, but I think a min raise fold versus this guy might be slightly better, maybe a little bit too exploitable here, but
I mean, he clicked back versus our three min raises too, and I mean, in some sense, like if he clicks back our limp, it builds the exact same pot as if we limp flatted.
that's true too. That is true too.
Sorry, if we min raise, it's if we min raise. If
yeah.
we limp flat a min raise, it's the same thing as we min raise. And again, there's a little bit of issue here where we're suited getting pretty shallow, so there's a lot of incentive to try to limp more of these suited hands to keep and suited drawy hands to try to keep more implied odds post and not cut our SPR too early. As played, we make a little thin value bet. It's fine. When you anticipate people's ranges are pretty capped, you do get some value here from their calling range. You are getting some protection. This is a spot where people tend to not check raise. On ace-high boards, people tend to check raise very little. So we're generally fine betting thinner. The less people check raise, the more you can value bet thin. Mm-hmm. The more protection you have, the more you can value bet thin. So here we have protection. We don't expect check raises. We're fine betting, especially when we bet small. Exploitively bet small to keep his range a little wider. And then we just go ahead and check back turn. There's absolutely no reason to barrel here. Barreling here is just terrible. You're just turning your pair of fives into a bluff. And why would you? You have showdown. You beat a lot of hands in his range. You still have outs and showdown and stuff like that. So we just check back river, hope he has king high, which he often will. And he probably did. Or some misdraw or something. We have a very clear flat here. Again, we're not shoving bluffs, and we're not folding something that's playable. He min raises a lot, so we don't think he's nutted. This is a really good flop for us. And I think, given the reads we have now, we might want to consider donking. He's been checking back so much on the flop that there's not a lot of incentive to go for like a check raise here. Mm-hmm. I think our hand is strong enough to check raise, especially this shallow.
I think that was the plan. Yeah.
Even just check shoving is fine here. It's worth noting that our backdoor flush draw gives us more value for check shoving. Again, it's an extra 3% equity, makes our hand slightly stronger. So our hand functions more like queen 7 or king 7 here than jack 7 because we have the backdoor flush draw. So generally going for a check raise here is really good. But given the reads we have now that he's been so passive and just checking back like complete air all the time, there's a lot more incentive just to lead. Versus most players, we want to check raise because they bluff a ton when check to, but this guy doesn't seem to. So there's a lot more room just to lead for value ourselves.
Oh, this was a strange hand.
And as played, we should definitely lead for value on the turn. No ifs and buts about that. Yes, it's a one-card straight board, but it's not that likely. Again, like people tend to bluff more often with draws than with air, so a lot of his sixes are removed. Some of his sixes open fold or don't min raise in the first place. So I'm not too worried about sixes.
I think my thought process here was even if I bet here, I'm gonna have to check back almost every river, and it's a spot where I'm like basically building the pot and inducing on the river and maybe facing an even bigger bet if I would have just checked back turn and maybe thin value bet river.
Well, I mean, you can always block bet rivers anyways. You can bet small here and small on a river.
That's true.
In the end, he doesn't seem very bluffy, so we're not really inducing anything. Right? Like, we don't really care. There'd be a lot more room if our opponent was betting sometimes on check two with bluffs, then, there's more room to go and try to bluff catch or something like that. Mm-hmm. But here, I mean, the one thing I would say is that, because there is a one card straight, we should limit our sizing. This is not the kind of spot to probe giant. We don't want to probe pot size or overbet or anything like that. If anything, we want to drop our sizing and maybe half pot here. Mm-hmm. Because we can, that's how we can take into account the sixes and again, try to keep his floating range a little wider with more ace highs, low pairs. But generally, yeah, I don't think there's really any reason to ever really check here. Unless you have really good reads, your opponent loves to check back traps or something like that. Yeah. And as played on the river, to just go for a small value bet. That's fine. And we fold.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I'm glad you said before he's not really the bluffy kind of guy because very easy fold.
I mean, fair, in this situation, basically almost no one is a bluffy kind of guy.
I mean, he has to have the straight here, right? Straight or a boat?
Yeah, I mean, bluffing in river spots is pretty rare, especially as a raise. I think these are some of the most rare places for people to be capable of bluffing. I once had a person, one of my first study buddies way back in the day, I remember you gave me a little piece of advice that still kind of stuck with me, that river is kind of the spot where it's sort of the honest street. People tend to play much more sort of honestly on the river. They tend to play much more straightforward. They don't they don't bluff as much. They don't make as big bluffs. They tend to basically just play the hand that they have. They know what hand they have now, and so they play it pretty straightforwardly. And so when you have these places, these are clear folds. And if you're not, like, if we sometimes call this shove, we probably would have been better off check folding or check calling than we would have been betting in the first place. If you find yourself in a habit of bet calling in these places, you're not alone. It's an extremely common leak. It's one of the most common leaks that, again, is even present amongst fairly high stakes regs of bet calling too loose. Of sort of betting and then being like, oh, I'm committed, or I have something. You might be bluffing and leveling ourselves. And B, I think it's an extremely expensive league in many cases, especially versus recreationals. It's just a way where you just burn like all of the EV you gained by betting the river. You just burn by calling off a shove.
Very true.
Like you would have been better off taking any other line basically than bet calling here. So yeah, it's a super clear fold.
Absolutely.
We go ahead and limp again. We want to keep stacks deep. It's kind of been a little crazy, anyways. I think limping is fine. We've been ISOing a lot. We can limp shove. A lot of people tend to, around these stacked up, stop 3-betting quite as much. And so it's very common for players to ISO quite a lot more than they 3-bet, which makes min raising for value pretty poor. And even shallower, people tend to call open shoves wider than they 3-bet. So again, min raising for value shallow tends to be pretty crappy. It's something that, I think is kind of outdated. I know it's like in Mercenaries ebook and all this kind of stuff, min raising to induce. And I think nowadays in today's metagame, generally limp trapping is better. And looking to limp shove your big ace X is a really strong way to play them. But he checks back and he leads the flop. He's leading pretty big here. So, I mean, there's room to call and try to like call down. But again, we don't think he's really capable of bluffing. So we probably just want to raise here for value.
I just feel like I was so nutted here that, like, even though it's risky flatting, like if a 10 or a 9 spikes, but like at the end of the day, it just felt like too good to be true, had to flat here.
Yeah, but I mean, we want to think like, why are we flatting? Like, what kind of hands are we going to get more value from on later streets by flatting now than raising? Like, can you think of any? I mean, yes, it's plausible he has a draw that we do slightly better if he barrels with it. But again, with the reads we have, do we really expect him to be capable of donking flop more than half pot and barreling off with a draw? Seems really unlikely to me. It's much more likely he has some sort of pair here, and it's much more likely that in fact we lose value by not raising, because there'll be scary cards on the turn that cause him to shut down and limit how much money we can make.
Very true.
9 of hearts, 10 of hearts, or even not of hearts. A king can be a really bad card for him. He might slow down on an ace. He might slow down the board pairs to an 8 or a jack with his queen. So there's a lot of room where we will lose value on a lot of runouts. And given the reads we have, there's not a lot of slow play equity to be gained. There's not a lot of hands we do, we do much better versus by allowing him, in the pot than if we raise here. So I think we raise here. We don't need to raise big because we are so nutted. We can try to keep in more of his random. If he has some random draws, he'll probably float if we raise smallish. So I'd probably raise here. I don't know. You could click it back.
Yeah, like something. Yeah, click back.
Especially since he likes to click back, he won't think of it as super nutty. It might be more like we're trying to play back versus him.
He might enjoy it.
A lot of players 3-bet really light in these kind of places. So with draws, a lot of players will shove over anyways at click back. So there's not, again, a lot of downside to, oh yeah, we give his draws a great price. Well, that's true, but if he's not willing to take that great price, it doesn't matter. So I think click back here works fine. Raising's like 120. Probably up to 150. All is really good. But he does go ahead and jam, and we snap him off, and he's got a queen probably.
Yep. So, yeah, I mean, but you were right, though. If I raise there, he probably calls me down anyways, or he just rejams the flop or something like that. And if a 10 or something does hit, he shuts down. So, absolutely right about that flop.
Once we raise the flop, he's got a lot less, money behind, and so it's going to be a lot harder for him to, make a fold on the turn or river. Like, he's going to be more likely to stack off with his queen.
Very true.
If he
Absolutely.
doesn't 3-bet the flop. I mean, again, tons of players will just snap 3-bet jam over you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he probably would because of the texture of the board. Yeah, he'd be like, oh, he's on a flush draw or something like that. Yep. Absolutely.
So yeah,
Fantastic.
definitely think we shouldn't be slow playing there. There will be players where you want to slow play. I mean, if you play against some, aggro reg and he seems to be donking a lot of boards with draws and barrels off with them, yeah, then we just call down, sure. But I mean, unless you have a very clear reason, especially versus recreationals, we really want to try to avoid losing value and want to try to, when their range is face up, I have something. We probably want to just make sure we get paid by that something as much as possible.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, also, okay, so great. So, hand history complete. Now, I know that you're a very busy man, and I know these people want to ask you a ton of questions. So
Let's see
we'll
some questions. I'm down.
All right, guys. So you hear that? So if you want to ask questions, just make sure you guys can do the you could do at Pbogz so I can see them clearly. Or I'm just gonna pick a few depending on how many of you want to get a question going. So let's hear some questions for Adam. Now
you can put them up so I can see them too.
Oh yeah, sure. Let's bring it over this way right here. So that's what we got right now. Oh, Whackpack almost had something there.
All right. See if there's anything. Minray is 100% at all stacked ups because limping is weak. Yeah. That's a completely outdated mindset, and it turns out limping is extremely, extremely profitable, especially readless, especially actually with the weakest parts of your range, deep stacked especially. So yeah, we should be limping a lot. Limping is really, really good. If you believe Minray limping is bad for some reason, you're making decisions based on emotions, essentially. Like, that's not actually true. Limping is not weak or anything else. It's an extremely important part of your strategy that you need to be making sure to use. Yeah. Yeah, this is time-tested strategy, overbet turn with top pair, no kicker. Yeah, that's definitely, he played that hand poorly.
And definitely a spot where you did mention the ebook, and even I still hear today with like newer students, oh, what do you think about the ebook versus the yearbook and all that stuff? And it's like, well, it's good. It's good for like some of the, not necessarily it's outdated in some spots, but for the theory and the thinking behind it still really holds water in my opinion.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that ebook is in many places where I sort of started my, serious poker studies. It really opened my eyes to different ways to look at spots and to be more evidence-based and to think about spots in more, specific ways. Yes, the actual examples that he works out are now a little outdated. Like the info he had was outdated. But I mean, some of those articles are gold. I read
still
the
gold.
first when I was in Fast Track, and it just made such a difference to my progress as a poker player. And it's definitely something I look up to a lot. And it's one of the major inspirations for for my upcoming Heads Up guide is it's going to try to be sort of take some of the best of Will Tipton, best of Merce's ebook, and best of some of the more standard guides like Chatter's Pack and CCC Tilt.
Exactly.
Try to really make it a complete product.
All right, so we've got the questions pouring in here, and the thing about Twitch is it always goes back to the beginning. So did you start working with programs like GTO Range Builder or PO Solver? And if yes, what do you think about them? Says Marshmallow.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working with GTO stuff since before there were software. So I still have crazy Excel spreadsheets where I was computing turn equilibriums for probing using just Excel. So I love GTO stuff. I mean, I think that the power now to not have to spend huge amounts of time to get crappy approximations, compared to where we were a couple of years ago is just amazing. GTO Range Builder is fantastic for, I think, newer players who are approaching it. It's much more approachable. It's much more visual. It's a great place to start. I actually have a video pack, GTO and Heads Up Sit and Goes, where I use GTO Range Builder specifically to look at different flop solutions, talk about how you can look at GTO strategies, what's important in them, how can you make the most money off of them. And that pack actually includes flop solutions with it. So that's a great starting point because you'll have pre-made solutions you can explore past the video pack.
And I've watched that pack, and it's very good.
Yeah, as for PO Solver, I mean, I think it's, for more power users, it's an extremely powerful software. It's extremely customizable, lets you analyze tons of different situations. And now actually PO Solver is starting to do pre-flop. So I'm really excited. I've got an upcoming pack.
I think we're calling it solutions to small blind versus big blind in spins. And in it, we'll be talking about actually pre-flop solutions as well, pre-flop near GTO solutions, as well as pre-flop exploitive solutions generated with PO So yeah, I think that they're extremely, extremely important piece of software nowadays, extremely useful. Especially out to more advanced players. I mean, when you're starting to want to fine tune your strategy, when you've got your ABC game down, you've got your solid strategy, and you want to move past it. You want to, understand how to play against more types of players, squeeze out even more edge, fine tune your strategy, all that stuff. GTO software is amazing. And it really, again, for me, it's almost magical because it gives insight into something almost primal. I mean, if we think about poker is really based on very few things. It's got this weird ordering of hands. It's got some, betting structures, but it's very, very basic. And so seeing the GTO solutions is seeing solutions to some really, fundamental concepts. Seeing really primal game theory in its aspect, and seeing poker at its barest in a sense. When you remove all of everything other than maximizing EV and having both players maximize their own EVs, you end up with GTO. And so to me, sometimes I still get little shudders down my spine when I see some particularly pretty solutions well converged and stuff, because it's just amazing. It really gives insight into stuff that I never believed we really would have insight into.
It's definitely a really fun way of looking at it too. It's just so bare. You're so right about that. Now remember, guys, a ton of questions here, so I'm going to try to pick some of the ones that are the most intriguing.
That's fine. We can hammer through some of the quick ones. Comparison average reg. I do better versus regs than. First off, you probably are dealing with sample size issues. Second off, this is basically always false. You sometimes can believe this to be true, but this is basically always false because you're making so much money off of random skew, random mistake.
Yeah, the fish is where the money's at for sure.
But most likely, one of the reasons why this could be true is that probably you're a calling station. Probably you're just not taking into account enough population tendencies. Where recreationals tend to be pretty loose passive. They tend to play pretty face up. You're likely leveling yourself. You're likely not, not using theory correctly. You're likely not applying the fact that, putting them on ranges. How much are you really putting them on ranges? Using their, using their bet sizing as tells, and acting based on that. Ask yourself that. If you're not putting recreationals on ranges, you're doing it wrong.
Very true. Like we said before, one of the biggest leaks is just people just calling too wide. I say it all the time. The biggest leak I see in coaching, people hero calling just way too much.
And it can be very important in advanced reg play. But even in reg play, many regs tend to value heavy ranges, and there's still a lot of room to hero fold a ton. So that's definitely I think one of the biggest ones. But again, sometimes it's just basic stuff when you're playing against recreational, especially readless, it doesn't really matter what your range looks like. It doesn't matter that you're exploitable, things like that. So a lot of times you're doing stuff for balance. Again, you're doing it wrong. You should be doing it for profit. Balance is done for profit. In GTO play, balance is used to make max profit. GTO is in some sense exploitive. It's trying to exploit another GTO strategy. And it turns out that balance is the best way of doing that. But in practice, you shouldn't be balancing just for the sake of balancing. You should be, adding in bluffs or whatever based on making more money. So it's probably a combination of not range reading very well, and also not constructing your ranges by using your hands. It's sort of hand versus range play when you're playing against recreationals for the most part. And so it's probably stuff like that. It could be that your in position ranges are too tight, or it could be your out of position strategies are too loose. There's a lot of other issues why your fish game could be worse, or your recreational game, I should say. But yeah, strategy facing villains that donk lots of flops. It's pretty straightforward. Continue pretty wide. Don't fold very much. Raise for value, and c-bet extra when check to because they're likely messing up their checking range. Is heads up cash game still profitable? And is it only about bum hunting? I don't know too much about this. There's still tons of heads up regs and heads up cash regs at all stakes. So sure. Is it only profitable? Is it only about bum hunting? Certainly, maybe at the lower stakes, probably not at the higher stakes. All right. Have population tendencies changed significantly over the last months? No.
Good question.
Population tendencies change very slowly, I found. Like, they change a little bit year by year for recreationals. For regs, they can change faster. But even then, they take at least half a year to a year to really change quite a bit. But for recreationals, populations tend to be pretty static over various sites, stakes, and times. They have generally shifted a little bit, but it's a very slow moving changes for the most part. What are the best plus EV leaks? Best plus EV leak. I guess the most important leaks you had fixed when you were a student. Great aha moments like the Honest River. Yeah, I mean, I think that probably fixing hero calling is one of the most important ones. I think the other really massive one is that people have issues with constructing value betting ranges. Again, the concept of how thin should you be value betting? And I think that a lot of places people value bet way too thin, as well as sometimes pass up on plus EV value bets. But generally, people value bet too thin. So it's understanding too, like, how to build, like, where is value coming from? How are you building your value betting range? That was important. And just being open to multiple lines, like being open to more. I think probably one of the biggest leaks I fixed was when I stopped c-betting 100%. Well, one of the ones was when I stopped min-raising 100%, and then when I stopped c-betting nearly 100%. When I started analyzing again more, like, why am I c-betting? What's the difference between c-betting and checking? And what hands should I be checking? What hands are too thin to value bet? What spots are good to check back bluffs in order to delay c-bet? So a lot of the times it's really being, critical about your own ranges. Really, I think some of the great aha moments are when you finally are able to put yourself on a range and understand why you have that range and, why that range you believe is the most profitable range to have. That can all be really important. All right, on that Queen 6 open-ended hand, how often is villain's capture factor in percent better than our capture factor? Well, I mean, you're kind of comparing apples and oranges. When we're thinking about our hand versus our opponent's range, you want to think about your opponent's range's capture factor. And obviously that's going to be 1 minus your capture factor, always. Like, if you're capturing 25% of the pot, then they're capturing the other 75% of the pot. Notice that sometimes that means that if I'm capturing 1.5 times the pot, our opponent's capturing negative 50% of the pot. That might sound stupid, that might sound kind of paradoxical, but that's where slow playing comes in, right? It's the concept that, you might have, maybe it won't be true of a range, but there'll be lots of hands that, if you've got a nutted hand, if they hit the river or bluff, you'll make a lot more money by letting them in because you would have folded out negative capture factor. So it's kind of comparing apples and oranges when you're comparing, his capture factor to ours. You want to think about, his capture factor with what? His whole range? Well, that's easy. That's 1 minus our percent. His capture factor is certain hands versus our hand. That's kind of confusing to think about. His certain hands versus our range. That's also kind of confusing and not super useful. So, you just need to be a little bit more specific about that kind of stuff. But I hope that kind of gives you some ideas.
That one is a repeat, the Dana FML one, yep.
We read that. Under 8 BBs, I've seen that GTO involves limping. Yes. Yeah, I mean, you should be limping tons.
Yeah.
The push-fold play starts around 5 BBs. And versus weak players, you can generally even limp down to like 4 BBs. Limp fold, limp trap, both generally are profitable, even down to like 4 BBs. So yeah, but especially between 5 and 8 BBs, you should be limping a lot. Versus recreational is like really a lot. Versus regs, you should still have a solid limping range. And yeah, it's actually really a huge profit boost. And so yeah, that's another pretty common tendency I see amongst players is playing push fold way too early. I mean, it used to be people thought that push fold started like 10 BBs, and turns out that's just burning money.
Yeah, mine might actually have a little bit of that as well. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. What EVRYs are sustainable? I don't know. 30s, I think it's something like, common EVRYs are like 3 to 7, 8%. Probably 9% isn't sustainable, but maybe it is. Yeah. I think 7 is probably reasonable. Very high goal to shoot for. 5% you should be very happy with. 3% you're doing well, but could do better. If you're doing less than 3%, you probably should consider putting a lot more work into your game, because you're going to be suffering from tons of variance, and you're going to be almost really reliant on rakeback if your EVRY is less than 3%. All right. Heads
Want to
up.
do maybe 3 more, Adam? I know you're a busy guy, so.
Keep going. I'm fine.
All right, just let me know.
Yeah, heads up cash on stars. Okay, I don't know what that is. Don't you think that jamming ace-x hands when we have 10 big or less is better than limping? Sure. Yeah, depending on the ace-x. There's a lot of suited ace-x that can still trap. There's a lot of big ace-x that still prefers to limp trap. There's a lot of in most cases, people are ISOing more hands than they call open shoves. So there's value to be had from that. As for giving them a chance, to check back hands they often call all-ins with, it's not super common that they do that. Again, people tend to ISO more than they call open shoves. But even if they do, it starts depending a lot on how well they play post. Versus weak players, this tends to not be too big of a concern. You still have a strong hand. You're still going to be able to play post-flop. The pot's going to be pretty deep because you limped. So 10 big blinds, a limp pot is the equivalent of a 20 big blind min-raise pot. So there's still tons of room to leverage positional edge and stuff. So yeah, you should still be limping, but certainly low to medium offsuit ace-x are basically always shoves with those kind of stack depths. A lot of suited ones can be shoves too, but suited ones trap very well as well. Okay, mentioned simple post flop. Yeah, so I use simple post flop for that small blind versus big blind strategy. Generally, I usually use PO solver. I think that it's sort of one of these things, kind of like what I said about GTO Range Builder. I think GTO Range Builder is kind of a really good one for people who are first starting with GTO play. And then as you become more of a power user, you want to sort of upgrade to either simple post flop or PO. I've generally been really, really happy with PO. I prefer the method of going through hands. I find it a little bit, like the interface looks a little bit uglier at first, but I found it to be more useful. So I generally use PO solver for most of my stuff. But we had a unique opportunity, simple post flop offered to do a really big solution for us, and so I think that they're very, very comparable software. If you have one, it's going to be fine. But yeah, I generally prefer PO solver. I think it's a little bit more. I'm trying to say it's more useful for power users in a sense. Like it's more customizable. There's more like features in it generally. It's sometimes easier to find some information that you're looking for. But again, they're very, very similar. It's sort of what you prefer. But I love PO solver myself. Pretty general question. What are the most important factors that should go into our c-bet sizing on flops heads up? Are there ever spots where we should c-bet flop a large sizing versus a reg? Yeah, so important factors are really, what range are you looking to c-bet? That's probably one of the most important factors that people don't really give credit for. What kind of hands are you planning on value betting? The thinner you're planning on value betting, the more you should use a smaller size. The more sort of, and so this means that if you're betting your whole range, it's probably better to do it with a smaller size because you'll be betting more thin value. There will be places where you want to do that. So a lot of it comes into your value range. A lot of it also comes out of your opponents. I found that, if you're playing against more loose passive players, you're generally going to want to size bigger with your valued hands. If you're playing against more tight aggro players, it's generally actually better to size smaller with your value hands, even on wet boards, because you'll get lighter floats. They won't hero fold as much. They're tight. We're worried about that. And we'll get check raised by a lot of their value anyways, because they're tight aggro. And so a lot of their value will just check raise. And so you don't lose value by using a small size if your opponent plays mostly check raise or fold. So those are the kind of things you want to think about with your c-betting range. What kind of range are you planning on c-betting for sizing? And what kind of tendencies do you expect? So for the most part, we're only going to want to do this this kind of c-betting large versus a reg It's really mostly going to occur in places where you have reads that your reg doesn't check raise enough. There are a lot of regs who have huge issues with their check raising strategy, and there even used to be, and I think they still float around occasionally, regs who don't check raise at all out of principle or something, like that's their strategy. They check call or check fold. In those cases, c-betting bigger can be quite a bit better. There's room to try to use multiple sizings. Like there's a lot of room to play with c-bet sizes, but for the most part, a good rule of thumb is that you really shouldn't be c-betting more than half pot without a very good reason based on your opponent tendencies. Half pot's pretty big on the flop. Generally, you want to go smaller. And that's just because generally on the flop, you're going to want to be betting kind of thin value. You'll want to be betting a lot of single pair hands, and your opponent's range will have a good amount of traps as well as thin value that you want to get. So oftentimes our c-betting is small on the flop. But yeah, there will be some fringe cases where you might want to bet bigger. What do you think is a good chip EV to have? So this is the same thing as EV/ROI. I mean, it's chip EV per game is. I guess you're looking for something like 40 to 50, and you can convert from chip EV to ROI pretty easily. I have the equations in my math pack. They're also publicly available on 2+2 in places, so I'm not going to go through the equations and bore people. Move up as soon as you can with bankroll. Happy if you're making. This is an element of maximization. Like if you're looking to make the most money as you can, then you probably should be looking to move up a lot. If you're looking to maximize the bankroll, the growth of your bankroll, once you're strong enough, it makes sense to play higher stakes and make more money. So I think that it's a lot up to your own, what your goals are in poker. Are you looking to make the most money? Are you looking to make the most steady money? There's a lot of room to kind of go both ways. Are you looking to study a lot and keep getting better? Or are you looking to more just kind of coast at a certain level? And at that point, probably not moving up is a great idea. If you're just wanting to coast and, make as much as you can before the games get too strong for you, then yeah, you probably want to stick to your level and be willing to move down, if anything. But yeah, it's a pretty fun. I have some recommendations for bankroll management in my Beating Spin and Goes pack. So you can consult some of that. Swong Sim is an amazing tool for looking at variance and bankroll management as well. It's freely available on 2+2. I was wondering how often you think reg population strategies change from month to month. How often they change from month to month doesn't make much sense. But reg tendencies change when new information comes available. Generally, there's so many situations where for instance, like when Will Tipton's Volume 2 came out, there was a lag, but it changed the population. When my strategies limped a ton, there was a lag, but it changed the population tendencies. That was even before Will Tipton. So when new stuff comes through and regs realize that it's better than what they're doing, then they start changing. Mm-hmm. But regs basically almost always need pretty solid evidence. They're usually delayed in their change, and many regs don't change almost at all, even from year to year. There's plenty of regs who just coast along on the same strategy. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And so, they'll still be using the same strategy they were using 3 years ago or 4 years ago. It happens. It's becoming much more rare just because, especially in hype, heads up has become so much more competitive. So those players just don't last years to be able to do that anymore. But in spins, I think that strategies change when more information becomes available and, when you start getting more empirical evidence and stuff like that. In some sense, when some subset of regs changes their strategy and does better, then people do better. Who's the best reg you've ever battled?
Interesting.
Really good question.
Well, I played Coffee once at a holiday party, so I don't care.
Yeah. The thing is, we never really should try to battle very good regs, so it's kind of a tough one. I'm not even sure. I battled Mad Dominox for a long time when we were both at 60s, 100s. Maybe not that long, but it was a solid couple sessions. He wasn't nearly as good back then, but he's really good now. So that's one example. I just haven't really battled too many of the like top regs. I've mostly just like analyzed battles versus them. So yeah, it's a really tough one to gauge. And players have gotten really, really strong overall. So there's a huge, there's a lot of players who are very similar, strengths nowadays. So it's really hard to kind of judge that. So yeah, I wish I could give you a better answer like Live B or something, but don't have any sort of super epic reg battles versus very strong players, which I mean, honestly, is sort
Good
of
thing.
it's a good thing. There's no real reason to battle those guys.
Exactly.
If I were to invest in calculating exploited preflop strategies, do you think people adjust over, say, 1 month or 2 months? They stick to what has worked in the past for longer. I mean, the population won't adjust to you. If you're always playing new players, they won't adjust. Regs that you play against a lot might. Like if you're using a very exploitive preflop strategy versus specific regs or regs in general, regs are quite likely to adjust, and it's hard to say how quick. Some of them will adjust within a few games. Some of them will take a month or two. Some of them will never adjust because of that. So it depends. All right. How to get better versus recreational players. It just comes out of building better ranges and understanding better how to play exploitively. How to exploit tenants. It's a combination of learning as many population tendencies you can get. Just studying frequencies as well as just general, bias and belief systems and stuff. And then from there, that's sort of half the problem. And the other half the problem is maximally exploiting it and making the most money off of those tendencies and knowing how to build our range depending on all these different factors. I can see Chippy use the spins, but there's no way to see how many games it is. So the one on the video pack site, I think it was like 44-ish chips per game. I remember calculating it. It was 6 tabling and putting in quite a lot of volume, but so I was pretty happy with 44 chips per game. It converted to really high hourlies at the 30s. It was like over $100 an hour. As far as like dollars graph, it was kind of I think it is up on the website. It's got because dollars graph is kind of misleading because it has a couple big hits. But yeah. All right, what was next? Where we pass?
It was we had a few just simple things. People saying hi in chat, but
let's see. Where was it?
If we can go all the way. Let's see if we can pick any.
Okay.
All right, so maybe like these two are probably the last ones right here.
Do you approach limp leading free-handed versus recreational similarly to approach? Yeah. You mean in like small blind versus big blind? Yeah, I mean recreationals tend to overfold massively to limp c-bets. So generally you can even just fire away with your pure air as well. You need to be more cautious with betting pure air because you're out of position. But yeah, it tends to be very, very similar to limp stabbing heads up in position. Ranges tend to be pretty similar. You have to be worried about the same kind of board textures and all very similar. Yeah. But yeah, you're out of position, so it'll change some stuff, and you might want to be more careful with some cutoffs and stuff. But it's a pretty similar approach. Who was one of your students or horse that improved the most and crush it now? I think, the one that stands out to my mind probably just because he's highest is Spirited Real. He started out with us in HOSNG.com program, I think at the 30s.
Yep.
Quickly moved up to 60s. He battled his way into hundreds right after they started the division. This is before they even had an EV criterion. So he got people to vote for him because he crushed them so hard. He ended up moving up to the 200s and then the 300s, and now he's battling for 500s. He was like temporarily in at one point, and there's weird politics.
1Ks too I saw him playing a few 1Ks.
Yeah, 500s and 1Ks overlap a ton right now. So a lot of the same battling. So now he's playing the highest stake. And I think, how they think they made it, he was one of those guys who just was extremely open with, getting better. He always wanted to make better decisions. He was always open to hear advice and other perspective and other lines. He was always very critical. And he spent a ton of time studying. He was part of the HOSNG.com program. We do right now, I do 2 group sessions a week. For a long time, I was doing 3 group sessions a week. on top of one-on-one sessions, which he was putting in the volume to do 1 a week usually, and he never missed any of them, essentially. Like, he would go to every last group session, was almost always there, always putting in the effort, preparing hands, would always put in the effort to prepare stuff for one-on-ones. So he just spent a lot of time preparing and making the most of, all the resources he had. And he studied on top of that on the side, and put in massive volume. I mean, it ends up being, how much time, a lot of it is time commitment and how much time you want to put in. But I've got a lot of students like that who went from low stakes to playing the highest stakes. Other examples: 307, Kerr, Torgoth. Those are even off the top of my head. I'm sure I'm missing someone.
And there's a lot of very good interviews with a lot of those guys on agesingle.com. 307th is one of those guys who had a pretty cool interview as well.
Yep. So there's a lot of guys like that. And for the most part, they were guys who put in a long-term approach to getting better, who invested a lot of time at the start to getting better and made that one of their massive priorities. And I think with Spirited, it was the most striking that he was able to balance that really, really well with putting in volume. Some other guys, like, for instance, I don't want to name names, but I've had other guys who really focus on getting better, but then their volume lagged, and that caused them to also lag in moving up. So it's not always the best approach, but they still got really good and still ended up moving up eventually. So I think that really was the main thing that I've noticed is just, guys who really put in the effort to get better were the ones who ended up moving up the ton. Obviously there's always some element of natural, talent and, abilities and quickness of thought and stuff like that. There's always other external factors. There's, in life stuff too. But for me, that's one of the most striking things. It's the guys who really put in
dedication,
above and beyond dedication to getting better were the ones who went above and beyond expectations.
Great stuff. Well, I mean, it's been a pleasure. Like I said, the value here has been amazing. I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart, you guys, agesingle.com. Thank you for answering all the questions. I didn't expect you to answer all of them either, but fantastic.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It was a lot of fun.
No problem. And once again, guys, agesingle.com. Adam always has a ton of stuff coming out. He always has such good material. I literally watch everything he puts out. So one of the reasons I've gotten so much better myself as well. So once again, thank you guys so much. Thank Adam so much. And we'll definitely keep in touch. And maybe a few months from now, we can have you back on sometime.
Absolutely. That'd be awesome.
All right, great. Well, have a good one.
Best of luck at the tables.
Take care, buddy.
Hope you all hit the giant spins. And
we all can hope, right?
Yep.
Take care, my man.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, guys. Well, that was fantastic, huh? That was absolutely freaking fantastic. I couldn't thank him enough. I tried, but I couldn't thank him enough. My God. Amazing stuff. So, yeah, once again, 2 hours with Adam there. You guys heard him talking about, teaching people who play the 500th and stuff. So much value here, guys. So much value. So once again, amazing stuff. Now, I don't want to restart the stream and build it back up and all that stuff once again, so we're going to cut it off right now. Once again, I want to thank Madison. I saw Madison. I gave you the little shout-out before. Obviously, you're on top. You have the gold now with that $15 dono. Thank you so much. But besides everybody else, thank you for stopping by. Thank you for all the questions. We'll be back on tomorrow. And yes, they know I'll be playing some spins tomorrow, playing some more heads up and all that good stuff. So once again, guys, thank you so much. It's been amazing. I can't wait to stream tomorrow, play some more. I feel motivated. I learned some stuff with, the half pot C betting and stuff like that. I was probably betting a little bit too big on the flops potentially. And then, limping deeper at 6, 7 big blinds. There's a lot of stuff to be talked about there as well. So can't wait for tomorrow. So excited. Thank you guys so much. I will see you guys tomorrow. Don't miss out. Don't forget, if you already didn't click the follow button, please scroll down, click that baby right now. We'll be back, playing hard tomorrow. So I will see you guys then. Have a good one. Talk to you later. Peace.